Welcome, Savage Rifters. We are here today with two very special guests. We have the creator of Rifts and the founder of Palladium Books, Kevin Siembieda. And we have Sean Roberson, the Rifts line editor for Pinnacle Entertainment. Well, welcome, folks. So we got some exciting announcements. The next in line for the Savage Rifts product is Rifts Atlantis. But before we get to that goodness, because you guys know a lot more about that than I do, let's start at the beginning. Kevin, how did you get into RPGs? Do you remember what your first experience was? What was the way back when? What was your introduction to RPGs in the hobby?
Yeah, I sure do. My first experience was the original box set of D&D. I had a buddy, a coworker, who had just discovered Dungeons and Dragons and role playing and was all excited about it. And he basically cajoled me and our other workers to, give it a shot. And the first couple of games I played was with a game master who clearly didn't really want to add us to his game. So they were lousy experiences. And plus, let's face it, early D&D, the group we joined, they were all already third level characters, third and fourth level, and we were all first level characters. So, if a warrior slapped you hard, you were probably dead because you had like a whole whopping 5 or 7 hit points.
And the advancement curves were brutal. They were just brutal.
It was. And so every time we wanted we wanted one of our characters to do something, one of the other heroes would step in and go, no, don't worry, lowly thief with 5 hit points. We'll take care of this. And, so it made for a really dull, shitty game. And, finally Julius said, because it was Julius Rosenstein, who's my warehouse guy and has contributed to various books. He's a great player, great game master. He said, hey, why don't I run just the 4 of you guys in this game? And I had pretty much been done with role playing, and those 2 experiences were so abysmal. I said, role playing stinks. I want nothing to do with it. And the rest of the group said, well, if you don't play, Kevin, we're not going to play. And I'm like, what are we, in grade school? And I didn't want to hurt Julius's feelings. So I said, fine, but this is the last game. I'm never playing again. Had the time of my life. Julius is an awesome game master. My character died at the end being a jerk, and I still loved it. So that hooked me, and then I was lucky because Julius knew a bunch of other people at Wayne State University. That's how I met Eric Wojcik through Julius, and we started the Detroit Gaming Center. So we had people all around us of all kinds of games, and I don't know, I'm a natural game master, I guess, natural storyteller, and that's how I got suckered into this business.
And that's kind of surprising. The surprising thing is Palladium was one of the first RPG publishing houses, and I think it's one of the very few that is still under the original creator ownership of the guy who founded it, right? You are one of the pillars who have stood the test of time, and that in itself was kind of an amazing accomplishment. Just seeing how I don't think anyone would look at D&D now and say that this is still the house of Gygax, right? It is corporate and big and, a very different direction. But, Palladium is kind of your baby, and it was there at the beginning, and it's still here now. So what do you think is a testament to that longevity? Is there a secret to how you've weathered the storm for so long?
I would like to think it has to do with being smart and knowing my audience, knowing the market. But it probably has to do with I'm too stubborn to find other things to do. I love what I do. Honestly, that's a big part of it. I love what I do. I love role playing games. I love my fan base. They're amazing. We have some of the best fans on the planet, and when I'm writing my games, I'm thinking of them and what they would like. And then when I get excited about an idea because I know they're going to love it, or they're going to go, holy crap, what is this? Or wow, this is fantastic. It gets my juices flowing and it gets me excited. And So yeah, I love what I do, and we made a lot of money at it. There are people who tell you can't make money in role playing games, and it's hard and tricky like any business. But yes, you can make money in role playing, and it's super rewarding.
Well, and along that path, I mean, you're also kind of one of the pioneers for licensing intellectual property. I mean, I think like reading about the history of your company and you in the industry, intellectual property is kind of one of the words that pops out to me. Because like for instance, like the picture behind your head, you've got a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle art, right? And so you were one of the first Palladium Books was one of the first to license someone else's intellectual property to make a game out of, and you got like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Robotech, and that was I think really early on. I mean, very very little of that had really been done. I think there was like Indiana Jones got licensed by TSR, or was it still?
Yep.
And that one, I mean, that one flamed out so spectacularly. It was like
FASA did Star Trek. That was probably one.
Yeah, and Star Trek, right? So those are kind of the four. I mean, those are four of the really early ones. And the Diana Jones Award exists now because the Indiana Jones thing they didn't find the right mix there. And now, like, the reason we're here, that Sean and I are here, is because you've licensed your intellectual baby to Pinnacle to create Savage Rifts, and so being on both sides of that, and being kind of a pioneer on creating IP, defending IP, and then licensing on both sides. What are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on the creativity process and on intellectual property and licensing? What gems can you give us?
Well, well, I think I've often said there's only three reasons to get a license: because you love it, it's going to open up new doors for you, and/or it's going to make you a pile of money. And any one of those is a good reason to get a license. In the case of Justice Machine, which was actually our very first licensed small independent comic book, Ninja Turtles and Robotech, I knew those properties well. Me and my crew loved them, and I saw the opportunity to get into mom and pop comic book stores and expand our customer base. So as much as we loved it, it was also sort of a calculated plan to do that. And then I think the real trick to make a successful license is, like I said, you got to know it. And then, Hollywood finally learned that with the Spider-Man movies. You got to be loyal to your fan base. You got to know what they love. You got to know what they want. And you've got to give them a product that they can recognize. If you don't do that, you're just screwed. And then with role playing, you have to have a world. The reason Conan games have always struggled, Indiana Jones game is a great example. I mean, okay, we're all going to play Indiana Jones. Who do you want to be, guys? Oh, wait, Indy? Mm-hmm. Well, we can't all play Indy. So, you're Indy, Chris.
Short round.
Short round, yeah, exactly.
That's about it.
And Sean's playing, the tough babe.
Yeah.
It's and then what? And if you got more than three players, it's just, and the world was not as cool as the movies are. Some of them, the world is pretty simple. There's a lot of other games that offer much more exciting settings. So you got to think about all that. Early on, because of our success with Turtles and Robotech, we were offered all the King Feature IPs. King Features did a bunch of popular newspaper comic strips for decades, and I was a big fan of some of them. Mandrake, the Magician, the Phantom by Lee Falk, Prince Valiant by Hal Foster. And the second they said, you could have all of them, and it was like super cheap to get them at the time. We're talking mid 80s. I was so tempted to jump on it, but I sat back and went, okay, Dungeons and Dragons, RuneQuest, Palladium Fantasy, they all have richer, more dynamic worlds with, serious magic and dragons and things. Why do you want to play Prince Valiant? I mean, the stories were cool, the art's amazing, but from a role playing point of view, there just wasn't a lot you could do there. It just didn't seem like it was any place I could go. And the Phantom and Mandrake had the same problems we just talked about with Indiana Jones. You know, who are you going to play? The lead character and one or two sidekicks. And after that,
Right.
you know, you're in this mundane world with, you know, a couple of cool characters. Who's going to play that? So you know, I passed on that.
And that makes sense. I mean, I think it's also kind of a larger version of the smaller problem that I think a lot of game masters have, where they're not really a game master. They're a struggling author who has a story they want to tell, and they want some of their friends to be in their story, right? And it's like, well, who's the cool person? The DMPC that you're telling us is awesome in this world that they have a story arc and everybody else doesn't really have a place. And just that conflict between, you know, scripted and sandboxy, right? Is script. Sometimes you want structure so you can tell a story, but players are often have a different agenda. But if you just do, okay, guys, here's a sandbox, do something, you kind of get players who will like glaze over and like, okay, you know, analysis paralysis. What do we do? I think it's a very similar kind of thing with the IPs in the sense that you need something where there's a rich world that multiple people can have an epic story in,
Right.
and even. You love the like. I'm a big Prince Valiant fan. That was kind of my dad introduced to me that comic as a kid. And but yeah, thinking about it, it's like I could probably write a Prince Valiant story. I don't know that I could write a game where there would be 6 or 5 or 4 or 7, you know, actualized characters that could do something that wasn't super scripted. You know, because it's like you said, it's designed because that character has certain connections. He's the prince, and there's, you know, all that kind of stuff. So that is kind of a fascinating thing. And I think even just seeing other people and what their choices for IPs are, there are a lot of cool IPs. The question is can you write a good game in it? And
and if I may, I'll say that's the great thing about Rifts as an IP and as a setting, right? Whether it's, and I think has a lot of potential for TV and film and all those things, because there's such a world and there's such iconic heroes that you get. There's so much depth that, again, that's why someone would want to license it, right? That's why I've enjoyed working on it, because there's so much detail there, that brings a lot of value, right? And so you have the same kind of thing. It's funny because those are the problems with these other maybe popular settings, but you know, that's at the same time their problem is Rifts does that really well, and so that makes it a great IP to want to make a game from. Just like in some ways, like Star Trek or like Game of Thrones, they make better role-playing IP properties because you have a succession of crews and different characters on these all types of you know, adventures. And I don't consider myself like a huge Trek fan. I love the show. I watch it a lot still. But I still know that I don't know as much as the hardcore fans do, right? Because there's just so much lore. And the same thing, you know, with a lot of things, but that's what really makes something you can really truly you can dive into it, because, you know, Star Trek could be a sandbox, right? Game of Thrones could be a sandbox, but, you know, sandbox adventures, that's the hardest to write.
Well, and then the other challenge is, which Sean just touched upon, and I'd be interested to hear what you have to say, Sean, about this in regards to Rifts. Is, you know, ultimately you're taking someone else's IP and you're in someone else's fan base, and putting sort of your spin on it. In Pinnacle's case, you know, they're adapting it to their rules, and you know, it's always a challenge of what do you keep, what do you let go, what's really important, what part of the story do you really want to tell that you really want to tell.
Right.
You know, and so you're trying to create something for a new fan base while appeasing the existing fan base. And it's tricky, and it always helps if you know and love the IP intimately.
Right. Well, yeah. Well, one of the things that struck out to me when you said, you know, if you've got these licensed properties and you don't do it right, the fans are going to reject it. Right. I mean, just like if someone made a Riffs comic book that wasn't Rifts, or change major parts of the story for no good reason, especially without having maybe comic books that set the scene first. I think alternate dimensions would be perfect for Rifts, right? When you see that in a lot of X-Men and stuff like that, they have these alternate dimensions. But anyways, that's a whole side conversation. But I think that it is a huge challenge, right? Because if you don't do it right, then you can alienate the hardcore fans. If it's too hard to get into, it's hard to bring in new fans. And so I think that the original design team before I came in and worked on some of the new books and the new edition of rules really had a tightrope to walk, and I think they did a really great job of setting it up so that it would, presenting Rifts in a very approachable format within the context of the North American factions. North American factions. But I know that when I mean, it's not like it was a one and done and people had fun and they're not interested in it anymore. People are still super interested in more and more and more Savage Rifts, products. And so that was one of the things that we had all the feedback, and we're working on the new edition of the book, the core rules and stuff, to go along with the adventure edition of Savage Worlds. We realized, hey, we really need to reconnect and make sure that we present everything in a little bit larger and wider context, because that's going to help. Otherwise people are going to be alienated as we move out from North America, for instance. And so I think that's one of the challenges. Again, some of the things you can't just bring. I fall victim to this sometimes. You can't just bring things over one for one, because not only are the rules so different, right, but the way that they're so different between the Palladium, the classic Palladium system, the Savage Worlds, especially the Adventure Edition, they're so different that like Savage Worlds has things like chases and interludes that you ask people to do constantly. So sometimes you need to give a little bit of affordance for that in ways that maybe someone wouldn't have thought of doing, when they were originally working on, say, the juicer. But those are some of the coolest things I think that and it's a big group effort that a lot of the designers have come up with, and we've had iterations of, for instance, the juicer's burn mechanic, and that's where it really shines. It's not, you don't always have to have a one-for-one transition, right? And a lot of times, and Kevin said this to me too when I was calling him late last year, and I was talking about how much I was having a hard time with Atlantis. It was just very challenging, right? With so many new systems and rules and mechanics. And Kevin was like, well, just make sure you have fun and that it fits the lore, right? And so his challenge to have fun with it, I really took that and kind of went with it. So I think that's the thing that people really want to pick up when they pick up a Rifts for Savage Worlds book. And that's one of the things that I think is really important about the way that we're handling this licensing agreement, is because Rifts for Savage Worlds, we're not trying to replace the Palladium lore or the Palladium story or the Palladium books. We encourage people to go read those books. I've had people online saying, I still play the Palladium rules, but I love Rifts for Savage Worlds because of all the adventure material, the great art, and then your books update everything to 109 PA. So I get this nice snapshot of that area of the world. And that's been one of the really rewarding things for me as a fan, is working with Kevin and saying, hey, I see this and this and this, the Coalition Navy kind of got their butt kicked here, and this other thing happened here, and the Pecos Raiders are going wild in Texas. Does this sound like a good update for Texas, circa 109 PA? Because I'm going to give like some more detail here. I think the fans are going to want that. And so that's been one of the really rewarding things, is building that up, making sure that the story matches, and it's all a cohesive world and narrative, even though it's completely different game systems. And, it's players that are looking for different kinds of things. There's a lot of people that still play the Palladium games and enjoy that. There's a lot of people that play Savage Worlds that came to Savage Worlds. Maybe they used to play Palladium, so they're so happy to see Rifts brought into the Savage Worlds system. And then there's a lot of people that have never experienced Rifts, and they've maybe even never experienced Savage Worlds. And that's just really interesting to see all the different types of players that come in to Savage Rifts. And so I think that also speaks to, again, the longevity and the value of the world and the setting and the storytelling.
Yeah, I think it was interesting you mentioned that. I think my first experience with Rifts was like middle school, and my friend Reese had one of the Rifts books that had. I mean, it was a really graphic piece of art. I mean, I think it was like a female soldier with like a skull and a spine or whatever. I mean, it was brutal and graphic. I mean, I just remember it. I almost thought like I'm not cool enough to play that game. That game's for kids that are a little more rock star than I'll ever be. But it was so intriguing, especially at a time. I mean, making bold choices is part of making something that people will both love and hate, right? Because I don't think any of us want to be porridge. No one wants to be like totally unoffensive because it's totally unmemorable too, right? And so when you make a design choice, I mean, obviously people want to make good design choices, but I think at some point you make choices that they're bolder flavors, right? They are, salted caramel versus just, something a little more or less bland, like where it's pungent and it might, the salt in there might offend some people, but for other people, it's like, that's really what I want out of this game. It's got an edge that this doesn't have. I think, especially at Rifts, at a time when some of the other games were running from bold design choices, really made them. And I think maybe even just in terms of scale, right? Like, so we mentioned before, like, Kevin mentioned that like early D&D, the curve of power between level 2 and level 5 is crazy and out of line, and there's just no way you can do it. But I mean, Rifts as a system in Palladium has everything from like slap fights, knife fights to guys walking down the streets with nukes. So the sense of scale is incredibly big, right? And interplanetary stuff. I mean, like you can really have a sense of scale in that game that. Maybe in D&D it's like, oh great, dragons are big. Well, Rifts, like planet-eating monster. I mean, the scale is just entirely on a different level, and there's no single solution for that, right? There's no one way to make that elegant. But you can have cool things that work situationally, and you get those mechanics. Like you're saying, like, you can't do it one-to-one in the Savage Worlds, but as long as juicers still pack juice, right? As long as it feels like these are powerful, interesting, unique, different characters. I think you've succeeded. And like, sure, some people will freak out at your choice, but at least you've invoked a strong response because there's power there, right? Like you have created a powerful piece of art, whether it's universally loved or not. I mean, I don't know. I think that's a more important thing to do in art in general, or even in game design, than to be like, this is. I mean, I don't want to pick on GURPS. I don't think GURPS does this, but like, I'm going to pick on the name GURPS, generic, universal. Those two words, they sound so horribly middle of the road, right? And I love GURPS, started in GURPS. I don't think the system does this, but generic and universal just sound like pejoratives to me. Like, can you please everybody? Is it, and I think
especially generic, right?
Right, it's just not a good word anymore. GURPS is a great word. Generic is just not a good word anymore. I mean, it's just not. It sounds like True Value, right? Like you can get the real food, you can buy the True Value version. That word. And I don't think there's anything generic about Rifts, right? It is Gonzo. Gonzo is the word that comes up before generic, and Gonzo has its own problems as the word. But I mean, that's an amazing thing. It's a big thing to bite off. So maybe a question for Kevin and then a question for Sean. So Kevin, in having that scope and having the view that this is more than a small story, these are huge stories. These are big honking heroes, big stories. How did you approach that in design, and where did you start? And what was that origin of thinking big initially, and how? To me, it seems scary. Like, where do you even begin?
Well, I think I tend to like epicness. I was a big comic book fan. My origin story is that I actually wanted to be a comic book artist and writer. And when I started Palladium Books, it was a temporary thing until I broke into comics, which I was starting to do. And then Palladium just took off. And I'm like, well, gee, I really like this, and well, I'm making a pile of money, so let's stick with this for a little while longer. It's funny you're mentioning the genericness and GURPS specifically. One of my big battles through the early 80s, actually all the 80s, was in role playing. People had this mentality that the game settings needed to be generic, that they needed to be very broad and not very specific. I had guys tell me I shouldn't do riffs. In fact, distributors and other designers saying, "Oh my God, it's too unique. It's too original. You can't do this. It's got to be more flattened out." And I actually listened to that advice when I did Palladium Fantasy. My original Palladium Fantasy game was intended to be much more unique and specific unto itself. And then so many industry people gave me feedback about, "Oh no, you can't do that." That I flattened it out just a little bit. Not really. I mean, if you look at a lot of early books, they're pretty cool and pretty unique. But I would have made it even more dynamic than it was. And with riffs, it was sort of the culmination of my philosophy of gaming. One of the things I love about role playing is that it's the ultimate storytelling form. I mean, you're creating these adventures with a group of people, whether it's 4 people or 8 people or 15 people, and they're all contributing to the story, and they tend to get epic, and people really get into them. And there's all kinds of different styles of play and approaches. And part of my style of play is I like to give my players a lot of freedom. So I improvise a lot. And I try to give them what they want. So if one of the players goes, "Oh gosh, I hope we don't run into a coven of witches," and gosh, I hope they don't do it. Of course, as a game master, I'm thinking, coven of witches, huh?
Mm-hmm.
And especially if a few of the other players go, "Oh yeah, man, that would be bad news. I hope you don't run into that." And it's like, "Oh yeah, now you are."
You're definitely going to meet a coven of witches.
And in the early days of gaming, people had a very limited, very narrow view. It was incredibly narrow view of what you could and couldn't do in role playing, and to the point where there'd be big arguments, like at the Detroit Gaming Center. To prove that you could mix magic and technology, I actually had a tournament game that I called Magic versus Technology, because people would insist you cannot combine the two. That would be unbalanced and it just don't work, and all this stuff. And it was like you could play science fiction like Traveler, you could play fantasy like D&D, but mix the two, no. And mix horror with that, or post-apocalyptic adventure, or any other superheroes, no, that's crazy talk. And I'm like, no, it's awesome. In my original Palladium Fantasy game, campaign, I should say, the Palladium of Desires, I didn't realize it till years later when a buddy of mine who had been one of my defilers came to me and said, "Do you realize you had all the elements of riffs in our original games in the early 80s?" And I'm like, "No, that's not right." And he's like, yes, it is. He goes, "Level 4 was the Vampire Kingdoms. Level 5 was the tech level. Our characters had particle beam weapons and body armor and a suit of power armor. Zarkzar the Mage actually had a lightsaber from that was given to Luke Skywalker from Obi-Wan, because it was engraved. We had all these elements. We had mad gods and horror, and all those elements were there. Even techno wizardry was there, because I had Dr. Articulus, who blended the twin sciences of magic and technology, or magic and science. So I mean, it was always kind of there, and I think that comes from the fact that I have very what Chuck Walton, one of my artists, calls a very broad and vast library. I love films, I love comics, I love novels, I love live theater, and I would draw from all these different elements. And to me, the freedom of role playing was you could do anything. And so when I created Riffs, I wanted a game that would allow you to be and play anything you might want to. You don't have to play it all, but if you want to play, some kind of film noir in the Chi-Town Burbs, you can. You want to play cowboys and aliens in the New West, you can. You want to have, combat, you want to fight dragons, you want to fight alien intelligences, the equivalent of Cthulhu, you can. I love that depth and freedom to be able to play whatever your heart desires. And that's what Rifts is. And tackling it, it's funny because, again, I think I kind of tackled all those elements individually, if you think about it, because I did Palladium Fantasy and I did science fiction with the mechanoids that actually came before fantasy, and again with Robotech, specifically power armor and giant robots. Then we had Beyond the Supernatural, which is all kinds of supernatural stuff and horror.
Modern horror, yeah.
We did, superhero stuff. So, I kind of tackled all those things. So by the time I got to Rifts and I wanted to combine them all, I kind of had ideas and had kind of worked out each one individually. Now the trick was figuring out how to put it together. And the big trick was, how do you merge all those different genres and characters and ideas into what felt like a plausible setting? And that was the real tricky part. And that took me a while, like a few years to kind of figure that out. The ley lines and the riffs really helped kind of put it together. So it's appropriate that the game is called Riffs. Because originally it was supposed to be, my germ of the idea, besides the fact that I wanted to make it my Star Wars and I wanted to make it epic, including all these different genres, the original game centered on the Glitter Boys, which I was then calling Boomers because of the boom guns. And then as the world just kind of took on a life of its own and grew and grew and grew, I'm like, okay, so they're more of an ensemble hero, not the lead. And an anime called Bubblegum Crisis came out that had these cyborgs that were called Boomers. And I didn't want people to think, I didn't want to confuse them with Bubblegum Crisis or think that I stole the idea. So I didn't even know.
You don't have hard suits of the Night Sabers and Leon the detective, so you're doing okay.
Right? And
he was a big Bubblegum Crisis fan back in the day, by the way.
and 30 years ago, you didn't know you dodged the bullet, but you completely dodged the okay boomer trend of the 2020s. So there you go. Like, your game is still relevant.
Thank goodness for that.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because, I think that, like Kevin's saying, with the Palladium games, they all had this common rule system to them. So there's some changes, maybe this setting has some skills that this other one doesn't, right? But they all had this common thread of how you handle all these different things with the rules. And then that meant that when Rifts came out, it in my mind, it kind of let you do anything. The possibilities were endless. When the original conversion book came out, how to convert your superheroes, your mutant animals, your kung fu ninjas, your Robotech Destroid pilots, right? All these different things, your Beyond the Supernatural or Palladium wizards, right? Into it, into Rifts. To me, it was just like, I think that's one of the things, and the fans still talk about these things. They still ask similar questions, right? And so they ask about these type of things, and what about superheroes, and what about this and that? And it really sparks the imagination. It means that you can play anything you want in this unique world that has a little bit of everything and explores it with a lot of respect. It doesn't, Rifts isn't tongue-in-cheek. It can seem tongue-in-cheek on the surface. It can seem guns on the surface, but when you drill down into it, it approaches these things, like you said, Chris, it's not afraid to dive into what are the implications of XYZ. The other thing is that I think that's why it's such a great combination with Savage Worlds, because a lot of times I feel like Savage Worlds isn't a generic system. I think it's a very universal system. And I say that because it has all the different setting rules. It has the different kinds of scenes that you can play that maybe, a lot of role-playing games don't have, really in-depth rules for a chase, and really in-depth rules for defusing a bomb or a social encounter or a mass battle. A lot of games, depending on what the genre is, they have one or two of those, right? But most games don't have all of them. Also, Savage Worlds has the setting rules, so you can very quickly say, in this setting, we're going to use these rules, right? And that is one of the really awesome things about Savage Worlds. Plus, it means that it's really easy to customize Savage Worlds for your game top, because you can say, well, we're not using this setting rule. Everyone has a language. They know when you say we're not using gritty damage, or we are using gritty damage, or whatever, they know what that means, right? In Savage Worlds, that when you get wounded, you also get roll for an injury. So that's one of the great things about Savage Worlds that I think makes licensing Rifts for Savage Worlds kind of peanut butter and jelly, because you have a really quick playing system that you can play either on a tabletop or Theater of the Mind, as many Rifts players do, and then you have all this support. And so the original team, the design team, they took stuff from the superheroes or the superpowers companion, the horror companion, right, the sci-fi companion, the fantasy companion. And then when we were working on the adventure edition, Rifts for Savage Worlds is the first setting that supported the adventure edition, which was tough because we were trying to we'd written 3 new books and we're trying to convert them over as the new edition rules was still being finalized, and then make sure that we didn't break everything. And so far, it seems like the feedback's fairly positive. People like this new edition of Rifts for Savage Worlds, but I think that's one of the great things between the two systems, is that they both have a similar core design philosophy that way, that allows you to really experience a wide breadth of role-playing opportunities. That's one of the great things about Rifts. One week you can be doing a noir detective thing. The next week your whole campaign could be noir detective in the burbs, right? Or from week to week, the game master can bring in these different elements, right? In 1 minute, it's high adventure, and then the next thing you know, you're in Atlantis, and it's dark, right? Cthulhu horror vibes. So, that's one of the great things, is that it can run the gamut of those different types of experiences and storytelling tropes.
Yeah, so I asked Kevin what his first role-playing experience, how he got into role-playing. I'll ask you, do you remember the first time you played Rifts? How did you get into Rifts?
The first time I played Rifts, I was running it.
Oh, jumping into the deep end of the pool.
So I started with teenage. So one of my buddies, my first gaming experience, I think, was the Red Box Dungeons and Dragons. Then I got really into BattleTech, and I was go to conventions, and we'd compete and usually get our butt kicked, me and my buddies, and they have lance competitions. It was really fun. And then each person piloted one mech in a team, and against other teams. It was a lot of fun. And then I started getting Warhammer 40,000, and the first game I owned was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles by Eric Wujcik, and then one of my buddies he showed me this advertisement for Rifts, and I started seeing advertisements in Palladium books that I was picking up, and
all the cool kids are doing it.
Right. Well, I was like, well, what? I didn't know what it was. I saw a picture of the Coalition Mark V APC with a dead boy in his full battle rattle standing next to it. I was like, I don't know what this is, but I have to play it. I have to get it. And so I picked it up, and then I conned all my friends into trying it out. And one of my best friends, I told him, you can play as a dragon. And he was sold. Like, he had never role played before. I told him he could play a dragon, and he was sold. And we had so much fun with it, right? Just so much fun. I remember the first big fight was his hatchling dragon having basically a wrestling match with an Ultimax, in the middle of there's a battle. You know, there was a mystic. One of the heroes was a mystic. There's all these different heroes, and they're fighting, you know, other people. And then this Ultimax, this giant robot with missile launchers and railguns, comes out, and the dragon had been morphed as a prairie dog in the desert to hide what he really was, and he just turned into full size and tackled the Ultimax, and they started duking it out, and it was just a wonderful experience. That was my first game of Rifts. I was running it, but man, it was just it. I didn't, you know, these were things that I'd never thought were possible, right? And my players are like, wait, I have this ability, wait, this here, and you know, the Ultimax ended up firing plasma missiles, mini missiles at the dragon from point blank, which meant that he was going to be inside the explosion in the blast radius. And then my player's like, well, but I'm immune to fire and plasma. And I was like, oh, you got him. Like, he basically self-destructed and didn't realize it wasn't going to hurt the dragon. So just stuff like that was just the first time I'd played anything that had all those different types of crazy interactions. You know, narratively, the rules, it all worked so well for us. And it was, like I said, it was a wonderful thing.
So follow on to that. So we mentioned before that the Savage Worlds has setting rules as the way in which you kind of customize it, right? And I think
right.
In my mind, from what Kevin was saying about developing a universal or generic system and going specific, I think Savage Worlds still shows its roots as being born in Deadlands, right? So Deadlands mechanics were super thematic to Deadlands, right? So there was the card mechanics and the hucksters and the deals with the Manitou. Those things are very in line with Rifts, right? Like the very rules. The rules serve to tell the story as well as the fluff. The crunch and the fluff are in alignment. I think Donald would call that the Ludo narrative cohesion, and there's no Dodo dissonance in RBS. So the what the game you play does invoke those things, and and it's obviously Savage Worlds took a step from specific to Deadlands into becoming Savage Worlds, which is more a wider view of these genres and the styles you can play. But I think in doing that, Shane and Clint realized, yes, we need to figure out, okay, how could we modify the crunch to fit the different styles of narrative, and the setting rules do that. So do you have a particular setting rule or mechanic, and maybe whether it's from Atlantis or from whether it's in the currently published Savage Rift books that you think makes that is evocative of the Rifts feel in Savage Worlds? Is there something that comes to mind?
Yeah, one of the setting rules that that I introduced is what is it? Blood and Gore in the Adventure Edition. And so one of the things that we had, if anyone's familiar with Rifts, mega damage is it's a thing, right? And getting it right is tough because Palladium's, classic rule system, and then the Savage Worlds Adventure Edition, or just any of the Savage Worlds editions, they all handle damage in a completely different fashion, right? And so what you've got is you're rolling to wound a target as opposed to plinking away at a number of hit points that you're trying to reduce. And so one of the problems we had in the way that Savage Worlds handles it is if a weapon does mega damage, and it hits another target that doesn't have mega damage or heavy armor, if a heavy weapon hits something that doesn't have heavy armor, that doesn't really make a difference. But if you're firing a weapon that doesn't do heavy damage or mega damage, as we call it in Rifts for Savage Worlds, your shot bounces off the tank or the tank-like entity, right? Whether it's a dragon or a cyborg, combat cyborg or something like that. So one of the things that I introduced was the idea that if you have a mega damage attack that hits somebody that isn't protected by mega damage protection, then you invoke basically the gritty damage rule. So if a cyborg's punching just some smart-mouthed city rat or vagabond or something like that, then
I feel personally attacked here.
Yeah, Landauer. But if that happens, then and he deals a wound, then you're rolling to see if there's did he break his jaw? Did he break his arm? Did he break a rib? And so that's one of the things that that was interesting and fun in the playtest. When you first read it, it might sound like it penalizes players, because in Savage Worlds Extras, that most of the enemies, the mooks that you're fighting, they can only take one wound. So most of the time, those injuries aren't going to be important for them. But when it comes to important characters or heroes, it is very evocative, and it also makes some of the regenerative abilities of the crazy or the juicer that much more iconic, right? Because yeah, the crazy got his shoulder dislocated, right? Kind of like a lethal weapon type of thing in this fight. But a few minutes later, after he's done his bioregeneration trance, boom, he's good to go again. And so that also makes him feel like a super soldier, him or her, right? Whatever the person playing is running. But yeah, it makes that character feel truly larger than life when they can take mortal wounds but then recover from them very quickly. So that's been a lot of fun, and that's one of the ones that I think was the most fun to work on.
Fantastic. So, Kevin, interesting divagation. So you mentioned that, like, you've got the heart of a graphic artist, and that was kind of how your original vision for where your career would go. The two questions. One, when was the last time you put pen to paper or brush to paper? Have you been doing art over COVID? And two, what do you think about how art in general, whether it's cover art or interior art, is kind of part of the selling your vision? I don't mean that in just a monetary way, but I mean, also just in the, sharing what's in your head in this expansive universe to your audience. So those are two for you.
Well, I think it's, well, first of all, I doodle and do art here and there, all the time. But and it's funny, in fact, for like the first 10 or 15 years of running Palladium, if people asked me what I did, I would say I'm an artist. And it took a while before I sat down and said, oh, I'm actually a game designer and writer too. Probably more writer and game designer than artist these days, because I could find a lot of people who could do art as good or better than me. It was hard finding people who could really get the complexity of designing role-playing games. I dabble. I still mostly pen and pencil stuff, sometimes a little inking. And I keep my fingers in the art side of things with art direction and wrangling my artists and that kind of thing. That's how we have all these great artists, because I know what they need, and I know what they're how to give them the best, I think, direction to get the best out of them most of the time. So as far as how important art is with the role-playing game, I think because of my background with comic books, where art and story are completely blended together and are equally important in my mind, I think they're really crucial. I hate games when I open up a book and I see a spectacular piece of art, and I'm like, wow, what is this? Is this a villain? Is this a player character? I need to know more. And you know what? It's just a pretty picture. I find that very disappointing, especially if it was very dynamic and got me excited. And if it's just a graphic design, okay. But yeah, I think the covers, the interior art, all of it needs to be dynamic. It needs to help tell the story. It helps bring your world to life. Because people can look at that and go, wow, that's my character, or oof, I don't want to run into that bad guy or that monster. It means a lot. So yeah, I've had the honor and luxury of working with a lot of really spectacular artists, comic book guys, some comic book legends like Jim Steranko and Steve Bissett and Richard Corbin, who recently passed away. It's been awesome, but I've also had the honor of discovering a lot of great people like Ramon Perez and Scott Johnson and Freddie Williams II. It's been great. Tyler Walpole, I gave him some of his first work. The guy has gone on to be an astonishing painter. had the opportunity to work with guys like Stephen Hickman and Larry Elmore and I are buddies. Keith Parkinson, before he passed away, we were like very close. It's been great for me. Again, as a poor kid from Detroit, in some ways, my life has been kind of an amazing whirlwind because I got to work with so many people that I know and love and respect. Gerald Brom, and the list goes on and on and on. It's pretty astonishing.
Yeah, I mean, mentioning Brom, I mean, I think there's no small success of Deadlands comes from that original Brom cover. And the fact, like you mentioned, it wasn't just a cool piece of art. That cover, I mean, Shane looked at that and said, that needs to be something in the game, and created Harrowed. And Harrowed is a whole, mechanically complex, but also very narratively rich element to be into the game. Like one cool picture becomes a narrative element that has survived, 25 years of play and enjoyment. And so I think let's branch it out. So Roberson, you guys right now are back and forth on art, acquiring art and getting approvals from Kevin on the art for Savage Atlantis. And what is that process like? I mean, it seems like, we've got, artists that are chosen by Pinnacle. So you've got Pinnacle style, taste, and art, but you are also appeasing, the Riffs aesthetic as well. And so Kevin's involved in that process. You're involved in that process. Shane's involved in that process. The in-house artists. So how has that worked out? Like, what do you guys do when you talk about art? You come up with ideas together and then shoot off art requests, or what is the process of creating the art for Atlantis like?
It's interesting because the funny thing is when I first was asked to write what would become Empires of Humanity, the book about the Coalition, a lot of the human factions in the New West in Rifts for Savage Worlds. One of the things that they asked me to help out too was to help communicate with the artists and be a liaison with Kevin. And I was like, I get to email Kevin Siembieda, Yeah, I literally told my mom today I talked to Kevin Siembieda on the phone. It was amazing. But it's been a really great process. It's been a learning experience. It's been really cool though. We have really great people that we work with Sigil Entertainment, who manage a lot of our art production and working directly with the artists and things like that. So that's really nice as someone who's a designer and an author to be able to say, here's my request, hand it off to their team, and then they can go through a lot of the basic legwork and other efforts. That really helps out. It is challenging though, because with Rifts, it's not, a generic cyberpunk, right? This generic where it's not generic vampire fantasy or modern vampires, right? There's nothing generic about it. And so one of the things that I came to realize is, okay, well, we have to put something in each illustration if we can, that's going to denote that this is a Rifts version of something. Even like there's an illustration of a mummy, and it's sometimes we have such great art in it, you could blow it up half a wall big enough and you'd still be looking at details. I'm really amazed with a lot of the art we get, but it's got a vibro knife stuck in its chest, right? That's of course completely ineffective, but that's hard. That's a hard detail to catch out, but it's there, right? And so that's one of the things that we look at. Another thing that's challenging is making sure that maybe we have artists from all over the world, from all different cultures, and so making sure that they can, there's going to be a little bit of their flair in there, but also I think that's a good thing. It's you'd say it's unavoidable, but I mean that's a great thing with a good artist. But also making sure that it conforms with the world that Kevin has already designed and built and the details, so that it's consistent. I know that's one of the things that's really a big deal to Kevin, and it's a big deal to me too, because any true Rifts fan, again, like we said, they're going to be disoriented or disappointed if we start changing things for no reason, right? We want to be true to it, and I hope that with some of our art you get to see things, like one of the illustrations for Empires of Humanity has a bunch of special forces coalition troopers working together, or the cover art which is bomb, right? And so it's got just, the Free Quebec troops, the coalition troops fighting together against demons and dragons and all this kind of stuff. So that, I think that's where you kind of have to dig into the details, but when you do it right, it's so epic. One of the things that we have had a challenge with is that, Kevin knows all these great artists. And so there's all this great, especially in the older books, a lot of really great black and white line art, which can have so much movement to it, right? And the Pinnacle style is a little bit more of a painted style. And so that's one of the things that we've slowly tried to massage to make sure that we can hearken to those lines while making sure that we have the full color illustrations that Pinnacle, is known for. But it is a challenge. I don't know, Kevin, what do you think? Since I came along, I think it's gotten easier and easier, I hope, to approve the art.
No, absolutely. In fact, I over the last month, I've approved a ton of the artwork for Riff's Atlantis that Savage Worlds is coming out with, and I have to say, I think it's some of the best art yet. I
agree.
Yeah, I mean, it's just really good, and they really captured the look and feel of Atlantis and those characters. I think Sean has gotten a lot better as an art director, because some of the early stuff we'd get art, and most of it was pretty good, but some of it would just be, funky, or and I'm not even saying it didn't necessarily look like our character, but the pose might have looked weird, or the colors were kind of weird, or it just, there were lots of little issues. It seemed like we were pointing out a lot of little things on the earlier books, and I agree completely, Sean, that every book, the art approval process has gotten smoother and smoother. I have to say their writing has been pretty top notch from the beginning. So I've been very pleased with a lot of it, and for me, it's been sort of a kick, because it's always cool to see your work reimagined by other people, and I love all kinds of art. So seeing all kinds of different styles, that doesn't faze me. My criteria for art and writing is always, if it's great, I'm happy. If it's not, we've got problems. And the writing's been great, but even the writing's gotten better, I think. And it's fun for me to see, because they tend to encapsulize the stuff that we publish. They'll take a whole, one of our whole world books and do it in 20 pages. From 124 pages originally, or several books. And I find it really interesting, because they've done a really great job in kind of boiling it down and hitting all the sweet spots and the stuff that's really important. And some of the rules the same way, like when Sean was mentioning the juicer and some of their rules for that. I mean, I loved it. I loved some of the innovations that they did. So yeah, it's good stuff.
And I was going to throw out there one of the things, that early pieces of feedback. Kevin hasn't seen the manuscript yet, so maybe he'll hate it. But but one of the things that I did get early feedback on about Atlantis and the Demon Seas, and that's another big thing, is it's not just Atlantis. It's tying together the underseas content, the Lemurian content. We're covering a lot of ground in this book that's coming up soon, and so I think fans are really going to enjoy that. But make sure you go into it with that expectation, right? We don't cover all the smaller ancillary stuff in every single Atlantis book, right? There's 2 massive books there, but I think
and buy them, right? Like, I think buy those books. They are still
absolutely. We call them out at the beginning of the book, right? Where it's like, this is where we're getting it from. And the thing that I'll say is, hey, if we give you the Katani Serpent power armor, it's really easy to extrapolate what the other power armors are going to be like, right? We have so much equipment and gear in this book, but also we're tying together the narratives for these different factions, where and it's it's already there in that's the funny thing is it's already there in Palladium Rifts, right? The new navy and their relationship with the Lemurians and Tritonia and Atlantis and the Not'yul and the Haroon, right? These are all the Reachers from the Deep, right? Lord of the Deep. And so there's things are already there, but that's one of the things that we take a priority in, is showing everybody how it all networks together, how these different factions are interacting. And so that's one of the positive things that I've heard back, is that, hey, seeing them all in one book, longtime fans are suddenly realizing that it was all way more interconnected than they realized. Most of this stuff I didn't have to go to Kevin and get approval to like update a bunch of this stuff. A lot of it's just there. And a lot of fans have come back and told me after they read, like, say, Empires of Humanity, and where we call out these different things, that they're like, oh, I really like how it all meshes together. Well, a lot of it meshes together very naturally. The only thing I really ran by Kevin was the revival of Ironheart armaments into Avenger armaments, and how that affects the narrative and the setting a little bit. But that's actually a pretty short piece of the book. But yeah, I think that's one of the things that's really fun. But again, for sure, we boil it down to 20 pages. We give you the high level overview. We tell you the major conflicts and the major factions. But there's so much there. I mean, there's no point in reprinting a book that's in print, right? Palladium has it there with great art, great background, great storytelling. You want to know about the city of Mu, from the floating city of Lemuria, their capital? It's there, right? You got all the detail. Like, we're giving you the quick and dirty of the faction and how these things are all functioning, but you can dive in deep on all of these books to get more and more and more material and more background. And again, Savage Worlds has a points buy system. If you want to build races, there's rules for building races right in the Adventure Edition, right? We supplement that with new information for DBs and magic and psionics and stuff in the Tomorrow Legion Players Guide. Put that together, you can come up with just about anything you want to. So I say it's there. I see a lot of it. Sometimes that's one of the things people come to this for, is the people like our adventure material. And people like our art and all that kind of stuff. But one of the big thing that people are coming for is, how do I play this in Savage Worlds? And so we provide as much of that as we can. I mean, a lot of the book is stuff like that, and player facing options and gear and rules. But take that, if there's something, if your favorite, alien race from the Atlantis book isn't there, well, you can still do that, and not that we won't maybe revisit that later, but yeah, we're hitting the high points, and I think people will really enjoy it.
So excuse me, I just wanted to point out too, is that the maps and the adventures in the Rift Savage World stuff is easily adaptable to our game system, and vice versa. But they have beautiful maps that, that's sort of a high point for me, is seeing those maps.
We work really hard on them. Alita Saxon with Sigil, she works really hard on those. We coordinate a lot of stuff before we ever send it to you, Kevin. We work really hard.
When it shows,
I'm glad you like it.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, so Kevin, you've got this expansive world and a narrative. And again, I think if we had to write down the number of name drops, races, cultures, places that Sean just mentioned, it'd be at least 40, right? Like, so, and that's just for one book, right? We're just talking about Atlantis now. Do you have a writer's Bible? How do you keep such an expansive world in your own head? Is it all up here? How do you hand it off to other writers and make sure that they fit in with what you've already established? What is that process as a game designer?
That's a big question, right, Kevin? That's your favorite question.
Did I walk into a landmine that I didn't realize was there?
No. We've talked about it a lot, though.
No, that's a great question, and actually, we probably should be putting together a Bible as a guide. But no, it's mostly up here, and the shelf behind me, has 30 years of books. So when I need to check something out, I grab a copy of Spirit West or Lemuria or Northern Gun or whatever the case may be. And it is funny though. There are times where I'll pick up a book I haven't looked at in a long time, like Atlantis, and I'll be reading it and I'm going, wow, this is really good. I wrote it, but I mean,
Who's the genius who thought of this?
28 years ago.
I had to hire this guy. Man, this is some good pro. What a great
I should
idea.
hire him.
Your answer is remarkably the same to Shane's answer, because I had the same thing. And for me, it was more of a frustration. So I'm like, I want to create a Deadlands thing, but I don't have 30 years or 25 years of all the books, right? And so I'm like, Shane, is there a writer's Bible? Is it all up here? And he's like, we've published the books, man. Like, get the books, right? It's like, that's not the answer I wanted. I wanted a Wikipedia for Deadlands, and I could just go and click and click. And
but if I may, I'll just say, I mean, that's the same. I mean, with Rifts, it's the same way. All the published books are out there, right? It's not like I, magically mind melded with Kevin and downloaded Rifts or something. It's actually a lot of work to go through and reread the books and make sure you're contextualizing them, and
it's scholarship. It's legit scholarship.
It's right. It's like it's some fantasy scholar, yeah. But it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun too, and so that can be a big challenge. And that's one of the things that I think and I don't want to speak too much for Kevin, but I think that with Rifts, you can get really zany stuff that doesn't fit the milieu, right? Of the special world that Kevin and universe, it's a megaverse, right? Because there's other dimensions too, right? And timelines. That if there's things that don't fit sometimes, right? Not everything fits Rifts and its lore. And so that's one of the challenges. And for instance, I already mentioned it in another live stream, but our next book after Atlantis and the Demon Seas is going to be The Land of a Thousand Islands. It's Rifts, South America. Rifts or Savage Worlds, South America, The Land of a Thousand Islands, right? But that's what South America is called in Rifts. And preparing a lot of that book was published, and when it was published, it was pretty early in the Rifts timeline compared to some of the newer books. And so making sure that all of that's up to date. And they also said a lot of things were happening in the book, right? It's one of those books you read through it and there's all types of machinations that are going on and about to happen or come to fruition. And so that was one of the challenges, was getting all of those ideas down onto a document, quoting we went back and forth a couple of times. In the end, the thing that worked was quoting the original South America books or other world books, because a lot of other world books actually tie in, like the Lemurians and the Malian Order. And then saying, okay, Kevin, this is what's in the books. These are the big quotes. This is what we're proposing to do next. Because there's just so much going on. There's a lot going on in these books. You could sell a whole role-playing game and line on just the detail that's in South America, just the detail that's in Europe in Rifts, right? As Rifts is so deep that there's so many things you can do. And that's one of the great things about working on it. But that's one of the ways that we've solved that challenge with the next upcoming book, right? Is to just try and get ahead of the train and bring it all to Kevin beforehand and say, does this look like that's a logical next step? Is that something that you're approving that will fit the lore and now be part of that canon? So I don't know if Kevin has any comments on that, but
yeah, it sucked, man. They did a terrible job. But buy the book anyway. No, I thought it was.
That's going to be the clip. That's going to be the only clip, like the Kickstarter video. 4-second Kickstarter video. A special message from Kevin Siembieda. Please buy it anyways, because
I failed.
Shane is not keeping up on the game publisher clearinghouse on houses in Malibu. So please have some pity on the poor guy and buy it anyways. But
no, I think they did a great job on that. I just reviewed that just last week. In fact, we talked about that. And in some ways, it's sort of their most ambitious book, because I think all the action in those early books were around 102 or 103 PA, and we're currently in 109 PA,
right?
And so they're advancing it like 6 years, 7 years, 8 years. So there's a lot of really good, insightful updates, and I absolutely loved what they did. I called up Sean and I'm like, wow, this is just great. I thought it was just great. It was very logical. What I loved about it is that it built on what was there, and it made total sense. I 100% endorse that book. I can't wait to see it.
Yeah, we're having fun writing it. We have got some good guys on hand that are working on it. So everybody's super excited about it.
Before I let Roberson spoil some of what those updates are, on the original Atlantis, Kevin, diddly do, Wayne's World back in time. Did you remember when you were first publishing Atlantis, what you were most excited about it adding to the Rifts verse? What was the element in that book that was like, we don't have it yet in Rifts, we're going to give it to you? Do you remember, was there something like that in the original Rifts?
I actually, pretty much the whole book. On the original Rifts RPG, we had this amazing cover, and there was a Splugorth slaver and the slave barge and the warrior woman, but they didn't actually make it into.
Right. Yeah, they weren't in the book.
Which we mentioned before. You're like, if it's a great piece of art and I can't read the story about it, goddamn, what are you doing, designer?
That's right. I broke one of my cardinal rules there.
But you made up for it. You made up for it. Okay.
Well, that's the thing, is I sat back and said, well, we'll devote a whole book to it, and we did. So I was very excited to see it. So was Kevin Long, my main artist at the time, and he was funny because he kept like every week for months it'd be like, so what's in Atlantis, Kev? Give me an idea what's in Atlantis. And I'd give him an idea or two. And he's like, oh, what else? And I'm like, yeah, I don't know, Kev. It's all percolating. And he's like, no, what do you mean it's percolating? I want to know. Tell me now. And I'm like, well, you'll see it when I get to it. And it's one of those things, too, where that particular book did really just totally form inside my head. So when I sat down to write it, it just poured out of me. I think I banged out that whole book in like 3 or 4 weeks.
Wow.
Most of the art was already done, and I had very clear idea of what I wanted in it. Most of the time, my problem, which is why you'll notice historically our books, are usually announced at 1-page size and end up being, 2 or 3 or 4 signatures bigger, because I have trouble putting all my ideas into one, into the book. Of course, the beauty of role playing is you can always take those ideas and save them for the next book or a book coming down the road. But so no, I mean, everything in that, I mean, just the idea of the symbiotes and the bio-wizardry and the Splugorth themselves, the minions, the fact that Atlantis, I always had a thing about Atlantis. I always felt I don't know. I love the myths and legends, and it's one of those great stories because it's supposedly real. The Greeks talk about it, and where did it go? In fact, I heard a great theory that it was probably more in Indonesia, if it existed at all. There's some really good geological evidence to support that, in addition to some other things. So kind of weird that Atlantis would be in the Pacific, but it's anyways. I follow that shit. I love it.
Oh, I like. Yeah, no, I always watch it. I think it was a year or two ago. Like the whole Tartessos theory, right? There's like the once was a city in Spain, famed for a certain metallurgical industry, and then now it's like a salt marsh with a bird sanctuary. So there's very little activity there.
Right.
But Tartessos becomes Tarshish, and Tarshish is one of the translations that might be Atlantis, and And I was like, I just want to go to southern Spain again now and dig around in a salt marsh with a bunch of crazy birds. But kind of like the Oak Island, right? It's like, and maybe even the TV show Lost. The question is kind of the value. There will never be a satisfactory answer. Right, so that show's in like 7 seasons now, and it's like, well, maybe someone's going to stop funding you guys just keeping asking the question again, because there's only so much of that island you can dynamite and dig up. But with Atlantis, because it's so much less, one spot we know at least there's a spot. The imagination runs wild, and you can really fill it in with what you want. But so for Roberson, can you give us some spoilers on some of the choices you made to advance the timeline those 6 years and
Well, I don't want to get too much. That's for the next one,
okay.
South America, right? So I don't want to get too much into that, but I will say that.
For Atlantis then too, yeah.
Sorry. For Atlantis, yeah. But with South America, I'll say that war. There's a lot of war. But with Atlantis, there's also a lot of war, and that's one of the things is that these different conflicts were already written in. But I think a lot again when you're reading through a 200-page book. And you read this other one 10 years ago, right? You read Atlantis 10 years ago, and now you're reading The New Navy, or you finally got your hands on a copy of Lemuria. You don't always make those connections. And so I would say that Atlantis is huge on horror, depravity, subjugation, right? Really brutal stuff. So this is definitely a lot of horror-themed adventure material. At the same time, you have heroes, timeless heroes, like the Kevin's invention of the true Atlanteans. So in Rift's Earth, Atlantis is subjugated by an evil Splugorth, a chthonic alien entity of massive power ruling multiple worlds, with various thrall races and subservient races that do his bidding. But the Atlanteans that escaped the collapse of Atlantis, you can play as those. You can play as an Atlantean nomad who has wandered the megaverse, preparing for the day to come back to Rift's Earth and try and retake Atlantis, to put an end to the tyranny and the slavery and all the despicableness that is the Atlanteans, the Splugorth and their minions represent. You've got the New Navy, so you've got a massive submersible aircraft carrier, the USS Ticonderoga, and its legendary captain Nemo, too. And so you've got a lot of I think that's the most iconically American heroes in the Rift setting in a lot of ways, because they were in an American military branch and they've survived and secret bases throughout the Pacific. You've got the Lemurians, which are sort of like the true Atlanteans. They're humans that have modified themselves using magic and technology, or the technology of magic, right? Biomancy, to strengthen themselves. And so again, those are wonderful warriors for good and light. And so there's a lot of these mixes of these different themes, but where Rifts gives you these terrible, depraved evils, it also gives you larger than life heroes. Maybe you can't kill Cthulhu, but you can punch him in the face, right? And so, and at least maybe kick him out of your dimension for a millennium or two. And so that's one of the big things that we've got in this book upcoming. And Kevin has yet to read this, but the plot point campaign is called With Spartacus. And so the heroes, the Tomorrow Legion gets involved with a slave uprising. But there's lots of other adventures. Right. So there's a lot of other adventures, though, with whether it's with the Lemurians and the Maui and the different the Reachers from the Deep and the Sea Inquisitors. There's all types of really, really cool high adventure going on here, but a lot of terror aspects too, though, a lot of horror aspects, which and Kevin could speak to this more, but to me, that was, at least when I think that y'all had horror factor in Beyond the Supernatural before it came to Rifts, but I'd never experienced that rule, right? Of making a check to see if the monster scares you to crap in your pants. And so when I played Rifts, that was my first contact with horror in role playing, and so that was big influence on me as I was coming to work on Atlantis and putting together all the material for it, was to make sure that we didn't do that theme short shrift.
So Kevin, on that, I think you're probably most famous for loving huge stompy robots with guns, right? That's definitely an amazing part of Rifts. But Atlantis takes a different direction than that, right? And What? Here's an interesting question. You mentioned before about just kind of having the book formed in your head before it comes out and all these ideas. Is there a white whale for a setting for you? A setting that like has been percolating that you just haven't put down on paper? One that you're still trying to get to? At risk of having the fans, but I know it's a risk. It's like fans are like, you mentioned one little thing and they're like, I want it today. Give me it hardback. And obviously if it's a white whale or if it's still in percolation, it could be a decade. But is there something that you haven't touched on yet in the Rifts first, or just in game design that you want to touch on or incorporate?
Yeah, I think actually there's probably a couple of things. One is I've been really kicking around for years, coming out with role-playing games for younger kids. That's I think in a lot of ways the holy grail of a lot of game designers, and but part of the struggle is the reason most role players are 10 years old and older is because, let's face it, there's a lot of social interaction in the game. And when you're a little kid, 6, 8, 9, hell, a lot of teenagers, a lot of college kids are hack and slash. So all they want to do is kill and fight, and that can be okay, but it's not my idea of role playing. And it's tricky to get kids really focused on that. On the other hand, the minute they hit like 11, 12, 13, I mean, they're just ready for it, and they get it. Even little kids get the concept of role playing, because I mean, it's let's pretend, it's make believe. I was running some games at the Westland Library for a while. They had a program going, and I would come in once a month to introduce people of whatever age, but it was mostly teens and preteens. And none of these kids had ever heard of role playing, had never played role playing. Maybe they heard of D&D, but most of them not even that. And I have this classic fantasy tournament that I run on a regular basis at conventions and the Palladium open houses and things. And so I would run that game for a new group of players every time. And it's amazing, just amazing how quick they just pick it up. I mean, they're just naturals. That is one kid who was astonishing. Very urban kid, was too cool to play, but he was sitting watching. Clearly, it was really interesting to him. I hope he discovered books and gaming and stuff afterwards. But this kid was phenomenal. I mean, he was just a total natural, to the point where it was one of these games where I happened to have two 20-somethings playing, and they got caught up in the event of the game. Part of the concept in this game, because you have a real time factor, is that the bad guys are trying to distract you from doing what you need to do. And this 12-year-old kid goes, because he finally decided to play. I mean, he was just like, you should do this. Why are you guys doing that? And I'm like, here's your character. Just fucking
sit down. Right? Sit down, kid. Here's some dice.
And he's like, what are you guys all doing? We're fighting amongst ourselves. This is exactly what the bad guys want. And the two 20-year-olds go, yeah, this little punk just fooled us.
Hey, kid, you want a job? I need a line editor. Come on now, yeah.
So yeah, I've been kicking around ideas for kid games and how to present them, and I don't mean really watered down stuff. I mean stuff with heart, stuff with just a game that's made more accessible for a younger audience. I think that's probably my big one. There's a couple other things I want to do, but mostly I'm pretty much doing what I want. I mean, something I'm really dying to do is finish up the Beyond the Supernatural series of core books, because the magic system was never really presented. What the equivalent of a monster manual was never really done. And the thing is, they both they're kind of tied together, because a lot of these monsters would have magical powers, and I got to do the magic before I can do the monsters, and and I've got a million other things I've been doing, but fans have been dying for it. It's all in here. I just need to find a time to bang it out.
Yeah. Right, don't pull a J.R. Martin and have everybody come after you. Like, is he going to get hit by a bus before he finishes? Is he going to have a coronary before he finishes? Like, you're a healthy dude, so stay healthy. We want to see
right.
Yeah.
I plan to be writing games for another 20 or 40 years. So
here's a fun question for you. So at some point, Hollywood, you mentioned Hollywood, and I mean, what's it like having Jerry Bruckheimer call you up and be like, I want to play in your sandbox? And two, like in the movie, not the movie of Riffs, but the movie of the RPG industry, like let's pretend they're doing this, right? Because it needs to be done. Like, who plays you? Like there's a pivotal court scene. There's like the guy playing Mike Pondsmith and Peter Atkinson, and then there's you. Like, are you a Chris Pine guy, Gary Oldman, George Clooney? Like, who could capture maybe Branagh as like this? I mean, who plays you in the movie? Do you have,
all those guys are pretty good. I think. I'm actually kind of a goofy guy, so I think George Clooney already has the hair, and
you do have Hollywood hair. It'd be hard to, yeah. Yeah, Sean and I are over there going like, you still have hair, so that's
lucky.
And unlike another famous game designer who still owns his company that his name is on, you're not wearing a toupee. I mean, there's another guy out there. I'm like, that's probably a toupee, man. It's probably a toupee, but that's good.
No, it's the real deal.
So yeah, any ideas on who would be you? Like
I like Chris Pine too. I like him as an actor. But most of those guys you mentioned, I mean, they're all awesome actors. It kind of depends on what point in my life too that would change things a little bit. And then as for meeting guys like Jerry Bruckheimer and Joe Manganiello and Ross Marshall Thurber, and we've actually been courted a lot by Hollywood. We got a call from Brad Payton, who did that. What the heck was the name of the movie? The big white gorilla.
Yes,
a couple of years ago. But anyways. It's wild to meet all these people. Rampage, thank you. Yes, based on a video game. It's wild to meet really famous people, because I mean, I'm only well known in my little niche, which is a really nice kind of fame. I can't even imagine what some of these guys have to deal with. It's got to be a nightmare. But it's wild to meet people like that. Who come up to me and go, "Wow, Kev, you're the reason I'm a director or a writer or an actor," and I'm like, "Really?" And it's always, "Yeah, your games. I played your games, loved your games. They showed me that I am a storyteller, and this is what I should be doing." And it's very flattering, and it's very cool to have so many people. I'll tell you, when I met Jerry Bruckheimer. My handler, so Bruckheimer has two studio heads, Mike Stenson and Chad Oman, and Chad Oman was my handler, as I refer to him. A good guy. I liked him, and so I had gone to meet with David Franzoni, who was supposed to write, the guy who wrote Gladiator.
They got to be award for it too, I think, too, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. And he's an interesting guy. He reminded me of a beatnik from the 1960s. Just kind of this, blue jeans and a sweatshirt, and just kind of a cool dude, who's really smart, and and then it was funny because I'm waiting to speak with Chad, and Franzoni sits down next to me. I don't know who he is. He's a writer, so you don't really see him.
You get a name and a face.
He could be anybody, and he sits down, and we're kind of chit-chatting, and he goes, "Are you Kevin?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he goes, "I'm David Franzoni." And I'm like, "Oh, David." So we have a really great conversation, and we meet with Chad, and we discuss a bunch of, because David was supposed to write riffs, and that was one of the original writers. And so we hit it off. We exchanged phone numbers. I got David Franzoni's phone number in my cell phone, and it's the meeting goes well. And Jerry Bruckheimer was off in Europe promoting the King Arthur movie at the time. It was just about to be released. And so I heard, people talking that Jerry was supposed to be in sometime that morning, but no one knew when he was going to arrive. And so I get done on my meeting with Chad and Franzoni, and I'm waiting for my ride. And they call me back into the office, and I figured Chad just had a question, or David. And Chad meets me. We're walking down this hall, and good old Chad sets me up, boy. He goes, "Yeah, so Jerry's in, and he wants to meet the man who made him wait 4.5 years to sign a movie option." And I'm like, huh, what? And the next thing I know, I'm in Jerry Bruckheimer's office. He's sitting at this big, cool, simple desk. There's like freaking Oscars behind him, Emmys behind him, Arthur's freaking suit of armor behind him.
I'd like to imagine there are explosions behind him all the time, too. Just a pyrotechnic budget of $1 million an hour.
Just follows him.
And I was totally caught off guard. I was not prepared. I was a gibbering idiot. He's like, "Kevin, it's so nice to meet you." And we shake hands, and he's like, "Yeah, I want to make Riffs my Star Wars." And I'm like, "Yeah, please make it your Star Wars." And it was the classic. And it was funny because my mind is racing, and I realize I'm even doing it while I'm doing it. But so he's like, "So what gave you the ideas for riffs?" And I'm like, "Well, back in 1981," and I'm thinking in my head, in 1981, what the hell are you talking about? He doesn't need your origin story. And I'm talking a million miles a minute. And at some point, Chad's like, smiling and just kind of leads me away. "Well, it was very nice to meet you," and leads me out of the office. And I'm like, what an idiot. I'm not usually starstruck. I handled Franzoni well, everyone else, but with that particular and part of it, I just wasn't prepared for it. And Chad had me thinking, what, making him wait 4.5 years? Oh, there he is. But he was very nice. Unfortunately, they didn't ever really know what to do with the IP. I think Bruckheimer, and his people saw the value and the possibilities in it. Obviously, if he wanted to make it his Star Wars, but and they spent some bucks trying to develop it, and they had several writers come in and work on it. But they were smart enough to realize that they never really nailed it. And that they should, I can't say really move on, because they sat on it for like 18 years. And we finally got the rights back, and I've been talking to a few other people about it. But who knows? And nowadays, they're talking more like streaming, which I'm like, yes, let's make, Riffs the Mandalorian. It's
right. And I think there are changes in the
cool.
industry. Right? Yeah, no complaints there. Yes. As if no one's asking my opinion, but I approve. But I think with like the Mandalorian, I also just think with like looking at what happened with Transformers, there's this and even looking at like how Deadlands would come to a screen, right? There's the issue of when you've built an immersive world that has, as you said at the very beginning of the interview, the technology and the magic are both super turned up to 11. And, so like with Transformers, you had like one thing, like cars become people. They're very mechanical, lots of triangles, polygons, big stumpy robot cars, but it was just the big stumpy robots. But if you have to add in, several different races and magic versus tech, and then the sort of Hollywood, I think, looks at that and goes, our special effects budget is going to be astronomical. Like, how do we bring it to the screen? How do we get the undead onto the screen in a serious and interesting way? How do we, and I think when you've done something like The Mandalorian, I think it's proven that you can take a smaller slice of that huge, expansive world and do individual parts of it very well and do it in bite-sized chunks. So yeah, sure, like second season Mandalorian, there was definitely, like, I can see they spent 77% of their budget on that special effects scene, I guarantee. But they also did little things like, here's a little fight, and you get a taste of it, right? And I think that maybe it's similar to just like absorbing from you how you started, and even how Savage Worlds started. Like one of I was kind of looking up on Wikipedia, and like one of the very first reviews of Savage Worlds said there's so much promise here, but there's not a lot of detail yet. And it's like, and then like you laugh at it now because you're like, you've got 25 years of books of detail now. You've got the library, like you have bookshelves. I can see all those Rifts books behind you. Like you couldn't have put that all in one book. Like all of that couldn't have been there at the beginning. You couldn't have delivered that to people. Like, here's Rifts, 5,000 pages, right? You had to do it 92 pages or 82 or 32 pages at a time. 128. As you said. So I think that's kind of interesting. Where the world we live in now is that because of Game of Thrones and because of Mandalorian, there is this idea that we can do epic on a smaller screen, bite-sized. We can still make it epic. I mean, there were dragons in Game of Thrones. They did that. That was fantastic. And they also had battles. I mean, like the battles in Game of Thrones go back to like Gladiator. You look at like only before Game of Thrones, Gladiator or Lawrence of Arabia or Ben-Hur, like, were kind of the films that could put that many bodies on screen at once, and people died in the earlier ones, right? Like there were extras didn't survive those filmings, but now they're just figuring out like green screen where you don't notice it for the subtlety, not the spaceship on a string kind of thing, but the subtlety of that. So I think maybe in the next 5 years there will be more ambitious directors who think like, I can take a bite out of this world, start somewhere, do it up. Even like Westworld. I think Westworld is a good example of. It started as a Western and then it was a futuristic sci-fi. And then, season 2, 3. I think with the Nevers went Victorian and with a little bit of, steampunk. And then spoilers for people who didn't see the season 6, whatever. But like, it's a very different show. The last episode, it's an entirely different genre. And so, I think seeing other properties get that treatment, I'm excited for Rifts and for Deadlands and being able to get that treatment, whether it's animation or special effects. But I think that's probably one of the big stepping stones or the stumbling blocks for that movie. Is that, do you have 2 hours where you can show that? Because even Star Wars didn't show you that much at the beginning, right? It's like there was humbler beginnings, but. I don't know, I'm excited about it. I'm excited.
The Marvel Universe. I mean, that first Iron Man movie was pretty small if you think about it, and it just kept growing and growing and growing. The other problem with role-playing games versus adapting a comic book or a novel or a stage play into a film or into television is. We kind of touched on that earlier where we're talking about, so for role players, it's great because we talked about how, if you want to play, something in the New West, you can, or an Atlantis horror or noir and the Chi-Town Burbs. But for Hollywood, it becomes more tricky because all those options aren't necessarily a good thing.
Yeah.
So, when you're adapting Ninja Turtles to film, 4 little turtles get exposed to mutagens, and so does this rat who teaches them martial arts, and they go on to be heroes. It's a clear, simple story. Whereas with Rifts, what is the story you tell? It could be anything.
Right.
And who decides that? What's it going to be? It becomes trickier. I think you really need someone who Sean is probably a better view of this, having had to adapt Rifts to the Savage Worlds game system. It's like, what do you grab? What do you take? What do you focus on? And with a story for a film, it's even trickier because there are so many possibilities. And it's great for streaming in the sense that, you could basically create the Marvel Universe with just riffs. It's that expansive. I mean, you could have a show about cyber knights, you could have a show about glitter boys, you could have a show about a bunch of rebels or city rats, and globe-trotting adventurers, and hell, people jumping to other dimensions. Again, I mean, there's a million different stories you could tell. Every world book, every source book could be a TV series if you wanted to expand it and take off with it. So, I mean, it's got that kind of tremendous potential. It just doesn't have the hardcore characters like Batman or Superman or Captain America or Tony Stark, Iron Man. It's tougher. So, in Deadlands, any role-playing game is going to have that trouble to some degree. I'm hoping that the Dungeons and Dragon movies are a smash hit, because if those take off, I mean, Hollywood is, no offense to Hollywood, but they tend to be like lemmings. So the minute something takes off, it's like, whoa, wow, the D&D movies were huge. What other role-playing games are out there? Hello?
Right? No, it's very true, and we've seen it with comic books, right? I mean, there are comic books that had like 3 issues out that got movie deals because there was just such a hunger for comics, and because it worked. It worked for Marvel, right? And it's kind of it's the other side of the same coin that we mentioned before. Like Indiana Jones has had a major problem replacing Indy. Right. I mean, we're literally, trotting out Harrison Ford well beyond his action adventure years. And they tried to make Shia the next Indy, and that I think didn't work. And they're going to try it again, right? I mean, I think there's another one in the works. I mean, I love Indy. I love Indiana Jones. I love pulp. But you're right. It's like they can't figure out how to replace Indy and keep moving with the themes and the genre. And then the other side of that coin is right when you have an expansive megaverse like Rifts or a world like Deadlands. Like, who do you pick as the starting protagonist? Who's the one, right? Or is it one or more, or a few? And so I agree with you. It will be interesting to see with D&D. I mean, D&D, they haven't gotten it right yet, and there've been several tries, right? So the several tries, and there's those of us who are fans of those kind of movies. But even something like I would say like Fifth Element. Like I think Fifth Element has become a cult hit, right? Like looking back on it, I think Luc Besson, amazing dude. That's one of it. That and Femme Nikita are like the 2 pillars of his career that I think are great. But at the time, they called Fifth Element a failure because it like barely made its money back, even with crazy Hollywood budgets. And it's like, I think it's a great movie. It's one of those movies where I could watch it 3 times in a row, or if it's on TV, I will sit and watch it. Love it. It is great. A perfect thing for what it was. But no one.
In the long run, they've made their money, but
but like, they don't want to take the risk again, right? Like that's the thing, is it shies them off, and so I hope, like you said, D&D. I hope they do it well and it makes the money, because there are creative Hollywood types that I think could break through here. I think someone could find the right formula to do it. We just need to see it done well, and then like you said, the floodgates will open. I want to see more of it on the big screen, and like you said before, like you're one of the rare guys in the industry who has both been a licensor and a licensee to great effect, and of intellectual property, right? And so mostly in RPGs we've been licensees of Hollywood or books, whatever. It'd be great if that turned around and then RPGs became licensors of intellectual property, more than just D&D. And not ragging on D&D at all. I mean, it will be the boulder crashing through the wall that makes the path for us to walk through. It would be great to be able to have that sort of that option, right? Because I mean, you look behind you. Like if you wrote down Star Wars on paper, it'd probably be one of those books, right? That's the Lucas put together probably 128 pages worth of lore. It was what made the first 3 Star Wars movies, and you've got shelves of them, right? And like there is so much there. It is so expansive. There's like you said, it takes scholarship to even go back and look at what you've created. Someone needs to pick up the ball and run with that. I think it would be great. So I'm excited for that. So any parting thoughts? Any questions I should ask you guys, either for Kevin or for Sean, or questions for each other to kind of wrap us up, as we're about 1:45. So we got a couple more minutes, but one final question from each of you. What do you think? Oh, we did it. That's it.
I can, if you want, I'll comment on that last thing you were talking
Yeah, absolutely.
about. So I think one of the genius things about both Rogue One and The Mandalorian is that both of them took some of the original influences of Star Wars and then broke them out and focused on them into a coherent story. And so I think that, well, and Kevin knows this. I've been, putting together the pieces of a Riffs novel, and that was one of the big questions I had too. And so in my mind, you need to start with, boy, you could do a whole show about Glitter Boys, a whole show about Cyber Knights. Okay, but you have to show people one piece at a time. So, in my write-up, who knows if I'll ever finish the book. I hope I do. And if I do, it may be totally different. But right now, the way I've got it organized is that the story starts off with a 15 minutes in the future type of approach, and then the titular character gets in a suit of Glitter Boy power armor during the apocalypse and gets catapulted into the future of Rift's Earth. And so that handles a few problems, right? Because the world is so bizarre, right? Now you present it as a mystery. That's the strength of The Mandalorian, is the way that they present just enough information that you're wondering what's going to happen next episode. Where are they? What's going on? It's got a lot of mystery to it. And I think if you take the same kind of approach with a story about Rifts and slowly let everything breathe, and you can't do that you could, but I don't know if you could do it the same. You'd have to kind of strike gold again, kind of like they did with the original Star Wars, to get it right. But again, if you look at how they did it, there's some masterful storytelling there. But I think the same kind of approach, and then you carefully layer in all the different elements. But that's the thing. The story is going to be ramping up, and new stuff is going to need to be introduced throughout half of a novel, right? So I don't know if it's an easy thing to do in a movie or even a trilogy and an episodic, but a tied together narratively based show. It might be a better way to do it. But I think at its heart, I think Rifts is a lot of Americana and horror and heroes, right? Common man heroes, everyman heroes. And so I think that's kind of where you have to jump off from. And it also gives you kind of a familiar place to start with, so that, I don't want to, my goal is if I ever finish this book, it's so many challenges, but that I could hand it to my mom, right? I could hand it to my brother, or somebody who's not familiar with Rifts at all, and they'd still enjoy the story. And that's a huge challenge, right? And so apparently, at least better than me have fallen before. Trying to write manuscripts for it,
well, including myself. I've got like 3 or 4 Rifts novels in my head, each of them quite different than the other. I have a movie script in my head because at one point Bruckheimer's people suggested that maybe I should take a run at writing the screenplay, which I was very open to, but that just kind of fell apart. So you don't know. And really, ultimately you need someone like Peter Jackson in what he did with Lord of the Rings, because he knew it and loved it so much, or Jon Favreau, who clearly loves what he's doing with Star Wars and understands the fan base and is giving them what they want to see. You need that guy who's got the clout and the love for the IP to take it and make it what the fans are expecting it to be. And that's a toughie. Honestly, it scares me, because here, when they brought in David Franzoni, I'm like, holy crap, this is awesome. I loved Gladiator, loved that movie, loved the music, loved everything about it. And apparently the script he turned in was just not up to snuff at all, to the point where they wouldn't even show it to me. So, and like I said, we hit it off, and he seemed like a great guy. And I don't know if he just phoned it in, or it wasn't a project he really wanted to work on, or, we just missed the mark on it. We all have, bad days, bad books. Not me, of course, but
right.
that's just me, right? But please still buy my books.
And that kind of brings to mind a kind of a good parting question for you, Kevin, is what do you think Is there one thing, or what do you think is either if there is one thing or one important thing? What made Rifts special that we get to talk about it decades after it initially came from pen to paper? I mean, do you know what made it popular? What made it take off? What is there one thing, or is there? What do you think was the secret sauce?
I don't know if anyone who has a hit product in any category can ever really answer that. I would like to think, the originality and the imagination of it all, but there is no secret sauce. It's hard to figure out exactly what the audience wants. I mean, I was true to myself and what I wanted. Rifts is sort of what I would like to see in a role-playing game that would offer you, endless possibilities. So that's what it was, and apparently a lot of other people liked it. But at the time, I think there was just something in the zeitgeist where we weren't the only game that started to merge and blend, different genres, Shadowrun, Torg, Rifts. I mean, those were the big three at the time. And why did we all decide to do it then? I don't know. And we all took kind of different approaches and had varying levels of success. So I don't know. I saw an interview on television once with the guys who created Power Rangers, and the interviewer asked them, so what's going to be your next big hit? I mean, what's and they're like, we didn't know Power Rangers was going to be a big hit. Why did that resonate with people? Why did Ninja Turtles resonate with people? Why did Star Wars? I mean, looking back at it, you can have all kinds of conjecture, but who knows? And how do you capture that lightning in a bottle again? There's very few guys who can do that. Steven Spielberg in film is a great example of a guy who, has banged out one hit after another. I mean, I'd sort of like to think of myself as that in role playing. 'Cause I mean, Heroes Unlimited, Palladium Fantasy have all sold over 100,000 copies of just the core rules themselves, which in our industry is considered, a smash hit, let alone Turtles and Robotech and Rifts, which, have sold 3 times that. But, I just sit back and go, hey, I'm good at what I do, and I love what I do. I think that's a big part of it. And the rest of it is just, I think, I hate to say it, it's kind of luck and perseverance and hard work. And sometimes you have a hit and sometimes you don't. I mean, I've had other games that I thought would be huge that just, went nowheres or did all right, but, they're nothing to write home about. So, yeah, I don't know.
There was a lot of insight, even it not coming to an answer, right? Because I agree. I don't know that there is an answer. I think we, even just mathematics and scientists and people like Malcolm Gladwell, he looks into these kind of issues, like what makes these outliers. And I think it's legit to say Rifts is clearly an outlier in the industry. Like you said, not even just the popularity, but the expansiveness, the amount of material that's been out for it, the longevity, the fact that even today a sub-market of fans in the Savage World's world want Rifts, and we want it with a little more language we speak, and just how popular that's been and how well supported, and that how just seeing it different but the same, and there's just so much more. There is that adaptability. So it's one of those things where you're in the movie of the RPGs, you just got to be a chapter for Rifts, man. There really has to be. And then the cool thing is that it's still going. I mean, it's not it's not the end hasn't been written yet, which I think is also very exciting and even daunting, right? At least with a novel, the writer gets to say, there's the last page, and if they don't want to do any more, they're done, right? You can say, Jack Ryan's done, or Jack Ryan's going to get 17 novels, who knows? But I think with a role-playing game, also just because it's participatory, right? Like, you've given a world, and there are people who play it 100 years from now when we are all dead. There's still that possibility that people will cherish this as their means of communicating and making fantasy and adventure with each other. So I think that's pretty cool. So not 100 years from now, very soon, we're a couple months out because we're filming this early, but look for Rifts Atlantis. That's the next Savage Rifts product that's coming out by our amazing team, especially Mr. Roberson. And thank you, Kevin. It's an honor to share the screen with a RPG legend. And of course, thanks, Sean, for doing all the work and like letting me hey, can you introduce me to Kevin? Can we get on film? Can we ask him questions? Can you publish more Rift stuff because I want to play it? So thank you both for joining me. And I think if everything works out during the Kickstarter, we'll actually get both these gentlemen back on for a live stream so we can answer some live questions as well from all you goons out there who want to get your questions asked, because I'm not the perfect question asker, but I appreciate your questions today, guys. I mean, we covered a lot of stuff: Hollywood, philosophy, the history, fun, role playing, and so yeah, I think we packed a good 2 hours into these 2 hours. We got the material, so I appreciate you guys, and we will see you guys on Rifts Atlantis coming to Savage Worlds soon.
Sounds good.
Boom.